Dear colleagues, dear students, and in particular, dear guests of the University of Cologne and Erich Auerbach Institute for the Study in the Humanities. As Vice Rector of the University of Cologne, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our university. We are deeply grateful that you have come to Cologne and made out of the continents here to the experience on the United States for the debate, we get especially and the discussing of what made to create wonderful model for democracies, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. At a time such as this, transatlantic dialogue is perhaps more important than ever. Universities had a central role to play in this context. On the one hand, they are institutional pillars of democratic society. On the other, the academic freedom they enjoy enables them to serve as spaces for the critical reflection on democracy and its institutions. At the same time, universities themselves are by no means free from mechanisms on exclusion, discrimination, and structural inequality. As Vice Rector for Anti-Discrimination and Equal Opportunity, my particular concern lies with the interconnection between the internal constitution of the university and its broader scholarly responsibility to examine and promote participation, inclusion, and equal opportunity across society. It is also from this perspective that transatlantic exchange of foreign education in the United States is of particular importance to us today. The University of Cologne can reflect on a long tradition of significant learning. She was a council of the Great City of Cologne that founded the university in 1838. And it was once again the citizens of Cologne who served in persuaded the Prussian Babylon to re-establish the university in 1990 after it had been closed during the German occupation in 1798. However, it is also part of the spirit of the University of Cologne that in 1933 it was the first university to be brought into line with Nazi policies, and that it offered no significant resistance to the education and persecution of Jewish and else deemed politically unhealthy. It's precisely the history of collaboration with the Nazi regime that obliged the University of Cologne today not only to reflect critically on the role of the university within democratic society, but also to prepare the and to research, teachers, and public engagement. The Erich Auerbach Institute for Economic Studies in the Humanities was established to serve this purpose. Emerging from the Morphomota Center founded in 2009, the Institute pursues internationally oriented research at the intersection of the humanities and the social sciences. In doing so, it follows the intellectual legacy of its namesake, the German Jewish philologist and comparatist Erich Auerbach, who was forced into exile from Germany in 1925. After a period in Istanbul, he immigrated to the United States, where he taught at Pennsylvania State University, Princeton University, and finally Yale University. It therefore gives me great pleasure on behalf of the University at Cologne to welcome you to this panel discussing on the markets of mediated standards of pension. Thank you. Yeah, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rahel Jaeggi, and I am the director of the Erich Auerbach Institute for Advanced Studies. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's panel discussion, also on behalf of Dr. Ian Wolf, chairman of the board, and Victoria Harbeck, the director of the American Harvest North Rhine-Westphalia. Today's discussion marks the conclusion of the Auerbach Institution semester program dedicated to this year's annual singing in public spheres. We are especially delighted that we have been able to welcome the two renowned American political scientists, Steven Levitsky and Lucan Ahmad Way, as distinguished fellows of the Institute. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia adopted the Declaration of Independence, establishing the decisive turning point of the American Revolution, a process that culminated 12 years later with the ratification of the US Constitution. 250 years later, the United States, together with much of the world, celebrated this anniversary with mixed emotions. On the one hand, the Declaration remains a powerful reminder of the universal principles of liberty and equality that it proclaimed, principles that have profoundly shaped the history of modern liberal democracy and its enduring promise of human flourishing. On the other hand, it also evokes the illiberal potentials that have accompanied American history from its inception: racism, discrimination, and oppression. This tension is by no means new, yet the political and social division that became increasingly visible during Donald Trump's first presidency have deepened dramatically since the beginning of his second administration, to the point where the resilience of American constitutionalism itself has become a matter of serious concern. The speed with which, since January 2025, a wide range of institutional, legal, and civil society norms have been unsettled through an unprecedented wave of executive orders has transformed what was once largely a rhetorical question into a genuinely open one. Where are the United States heading? Something fundamental has shifted within the architecture of American democracy. What remains uncertain is how irreversible these transformations will prove to be, how enduring their destructive effects may become, whether they threaten the core institutions of one of the world's oldest democracies, and what consequences the growing social acceptance of dehumanization, exclusion, and political violence will have for American society. The United States is not alone in confronting these developments. An increasing number of Western democracies are experiencing comparable tendencies. These are not violent coups. Rather, they are gradual processes. They draw upon broad, expanding public support, becoming or threatening to become politically majoritarian. As Steven Levitsky and Lucan Ahmad Way have recently put it, I quote, "Democracy is in greater peril today than at any time in modern US history," end quote. The central question of today's discussion, therefore, is how we can best understand and conceptualize these multiple forms of democratic erosion, their novel dynamics and their different dimensions. To explore these questions, we invited 4 distinguished scholars, each of whom has made significant, albeit very different, contributions to this debate. It is therefore particularly unfortunate that Sven Reichardt was forced to cancel his participation at short notice due to illness. As one of the leading scholars of the global history of fascism, he has recently proposed analyzing the ongoing transformation of liberal democratic societies through the concept of post-fascism. We had very much hoped to bring this perspective into conversation with Steven Levitsky's and Lucan Ahmad Way's influential concept of competitive authoritarianism and with Rahel Jaeggi's argument for understanding the contemporary developments in Europe and the United States as processes of fascisation. Allow me to briefly explain why this exchange is so important to us. Only a few weeks ago,
And today again, Jan Philipp Riensma questioned in a widely discussed essay published in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung whether the concept of fascism remains analytically useful for understanding current political developments in the United States and Europe. This is not the place to engage his argument in detail. What seems more relevant for today's discussion is his broader skepticism towards conceptual work itself, a skepticism reflected, among other things, in his tendency to speak of labels rather than concepts. Yet concepts are not labels that scholars attach to political phenomena merely to classify them into convenient categories. The English word concept is in fact more precise than the German Begriff. Concepts are explanatory frameworks. They reveal structures, illuminate relationships, and make visible connections that would otherwise remain hidden. They are embedded within broader theoretical and methodological traditions and remain dynamic. They do not claim to establish final truths, but instead open fields of inquiry and contestation. This may be unsatisfying for those seeking simple answers, but it is indispensable for serious scholarship. Without conceptual work, the description of political phenomena risks collapsing into little more than opinion. In precisely this sense, all three of our guests today engage in what one might call conceptual work in the best tradition of the social science and humanities. They debate concepts because concepts provide distinct perspectives on political reality. Before inviting our panelists to elaborate on these different perspectives, let me briefly introduce them. Steven Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he also serves as Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Lucan Ahmad Way is Distinguished Professor of Democracy in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. In addition to the influential individual scholarship on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, they have produced a remarkable body of collaborative work. At the center of their research stands the theory of competitive authoritarianism, through which they have analyzed hybrid political regimes in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and more recently, the United States. Let me mention only two landmark publications: Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War in 2010, and Revolution and Dictatorship, The Violent Origins of Durable Authoritarianism in 2022. Already during Donald Trump's first presidency, Steven Levitsky, together with Daniel Ziblatt, extended this line of inquiry to the United States with the publication of How Democracies Die in 2018. Translated into more than 30 languages, the book became an international bestseller and has profoundly shaped public debates about democratic backsliding. Steven Levitsky and Lucan Way, together with Daniel Ziblatt, are currently completing a new study examining Trump's second presidency. Rahel Jaeggi is professor of practical philosophy and social philosophy at the Humboldt University of Berlin and director of the Center for Social Critique. As one of the leading representatives of contemporary critical theory, her work has addressed questions of alienation, progress and regression, capitalism, and social transformation. At the same time, she has consistently engaged with one of critical theory's foundational concerns: understanding the emergence and enduring legacy of fascism in order to illuminate the present. Other than Steven Levitsky and Lucan Way, Rahel Jaeggi focuses less on institutional structures than on the social dispositions, effective constellations, and asymmetries that sustain authoritarian transformation. The concept of fascisation, employed by her and by other scholars associated with critical theory, directs attention to the gradual societal processes through which support for authoritarian regimes is generated, the emergence of dispositions that make individuals receptive to authoritarian and fascist ideologies. This perspective highlights the connections between illiberal tendencies within democratic societies and the rise of contemporary right-wing populism. These different perspectives may not provide a single definite answer to the question of where America is heading. They do, however, allow us to draw the contours of the transformations currently underway with greater analytical precision. What these contours look like, what drives them, and what political and normative implications they carry will be the subject of our discussion over the next 90 minutes. It is now my great pleasure to hand the discussion over to our moderator, Stefanie Rode. Many of you will already know Stefanie Rode from Deutschlandfunk, from her work as moderator at the Lit Cologne and Phil Cologne festivals, and since September 2025 as one of the hosts of Nano Talk on Dreisat. We are delighted that she has agreed to moderate this evening's discussion. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Anja Lemke, for this introduction. Very warm welcome from my side as well. I'm very delighted to see all of you here, and I have to thank you in the beginning that you all chose political reflection over a very nice cold beer on a sunny evening. So thank you so much for being here. And as we've just heard, this conversation takes place in a very remarkable moment of American history. As the US is celebrating its 250th anniversary, Donald Trump's second presidency has raised fundamental questions about the future of American democracy, about the rule of law, and about the constitutional checks and balances. And some of these tensions, as we've just heard, are not new because the Declaration of Independence itself contains a fundamental paradox. It unleashed a powerful emancipatory vision while at the same time enabling exclusion and also dehumanization. And so over the next 90 minutes, I would like to explore specifically three questions. They're quite broad, but I will hope that we will cover a lot of ground. The first question is, are we witnessing a democratic backsliding or something that we would call authoritarianism, or would we even speak about some form of fascism? And if so, is this a new phenomenon, or have we seen this before in the history of the United States? And then what are the resources that still exist to reverse the trajectory we're on right now? And also we want to see what long-term effects the normalization of political violence and also of the disregard for political processes have. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce all these guests. Thank you very much for being here, our distinguished guests, Professor Rahel Jaeggi, Professor Steven Levitsky, and Professor Lucan Way. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Steven, I want to start with you and I want to jump right in. Donald Trump recently said in an interview that there are no limits to his power. What do you think would the founding fathers say about the current state of the United States?
Well, there are parts of the United States that the founding fathers would not remotely recognize.
For example?
The founding fathers would not recognize a democracy.
Ah, right.
The United States was not born, we like to say
As a
that we're a
republic.
250-year-old democracy. We were not born a democracy. The founders could not possibly have imagined a world in which all citizens, particularly women, non-white citizens, can vote. So the kind of multiracial democracy that was emerging in the United States in the 21st century would have been unimaginable to the founders. But Donald Trump is someone who would have been very recognizable to the founders. The founders created our Constitution, which is a very liberal, very counter-majoritarian Constitution, because they were terrified of demagogues. They created a set of very elaborate rules to constrain power because they were worried about demagogues who would impose their will. I think if you read James Madison, if you read Alexander Hamilton, they foresee Donald Trump, and that very much shaped their vision and the rules that they designed.
Lucan, would you say that some of the developments that we're seeing right now could be called unprecedented in American history?
Yes, I think it is unprecedented in terms of modern American history. I think, first of all, I just want to state that America, following on what Steven Levitsky mentioned, we tend to think of the United States as being the oldest democracy, 250 years old. Now, of course, there have been many problems with American democracy. Above all is the question of suffrage, and really, African Americans only gained full suffrage in 1965. So you can really say that we've, by standard definitions of democracy, America has only been a democracy, for about 50, 60 years. So it's quite a young democracy. However, in terms of the last 50 or 60 years, I think what's going on now is truly unprecedented. You've never seen, even under Richard Nixon, who of course attempted to weaponize the state, he was thwarted, very quickly by his own Republican Party. Donald Trump has been much more effective at weaponizing the state and much more systematic at going after opposition than you've really seen in anybody's lifetime in the United States.
Rahel, you're a philosopher, and you have studied the work of the German philosopher Hannah Arendt extensively. Hannah Arendt lived in the United States, and she was thinking a lot about the 200-year celebration. Now we're celebrating 250 years. She was concerned with the 200-year celebration that was in 1976. And she was very concerned and very expressive about the decline of the United States. And she would write about how Americans have to live up to the ideals and the aspirations of their constitutions. What do you think Hannah Arendt would say about the United States today?
Not an easy guess. I mean, I would say the least she would say is that there is a backlash into some kind of McCarthyism, which is something she was very concerned about too. I'm not sure whether she would use the word fascism or even totalitarianism, but looking at her work and trying to figure out what kind of concepts we could use in order to understand the situation, there are moments. I mean, in those, specifically in the last year, where one had to think about. Of Hannah Arendt's analysis. For example, let's say one moment that really frightened me was when Trump started to sign his executive orders in a stadium, which is in some way, or signing after the election, like creating this movement and building on this movement, on the MAGA movement, but also creating those moments where all of a sudden everything that is so power is like symbolized in this very moment and acclaimed for by the masses and so on. So this is something that I think, so the movement character of this development would have been something that Hannah Arendt would be concerned about. Also, what not only Hannah Arendt, also other analysis of German fascism has called the double state, and her idea that what is happening is that you create double institutions. You do not necessarily close down institutions or shut them down, but you create another institution that becomes more and more important and is the institution where the real power is. And I think something like, what happened with ICE is, let's say, has aspects of this. This kind of, there is an institution that has become so powerful and that is at the same time and not responsible to, and no one can actually somehow the limits are hard to set here. So those are moments. There are also moments. Hannah Arendt's analysis of German totalitarianism very much built on the sociological analysis. She wouldn't have called it sociological, but worldlessness and world alienation and masses and the mob who is in a certain situation where even self-interest doesn't count anymore. So this kind of, to go for the craziest ideas and to go for like illusions of national unity, national recovery, remigration. Here in Germany we have this whole debate about remigration and so on. This seems to be, these seem to be dimensions and aspects that you can at least understand with Hannah Arendt and what she herself would have said. As you know, she was very, very fond of the United States. She was one of those Jewish refugees and immigrants who really thought highly about American democratic institutions and also about the civil society. So I think she would have, I don't know, probably she would have had some trust in civil society to rebuild democracy, but I don't know.
We'll dive into that later, but can you connect to this analysis of, like a potential analysis Hannah Arendt would come up with today, Stephen?
Well, I think taking up the last point, perhaps Hannah Arendt's trust in American civil society had some basis. We very fortunately were shown, hopefully, the limits of ISIS lawlessness. We in the United States, it's hard to imagine. We were living a few months ago in a situation with heavily armed, masked men patrolling the streets, beating citizens and non-citizens. And this dual state, which I think is, you very rightly point to, and threatens to emerge, received a setback, at least, earlier this year when the citizens of Minnesota, very well organized in civil society, stepped up, white American citizens stepped up and said, no, you cannot treat Somali Americans or even Somali migrants who are not American citizens, you cannot treat them this way. They refused to accept a dual state, and they stepped up and they organized and they worked and they took risks. They risked their own physical lives, as we saw. And at least for now, they set back what the closest thing that I've seen to a fascist project in the second Trump administration.
Now the question is, how can we best understand the multiple forms of democratic erosion? And you came up with the concept, we've just heard that, of competitive authoritarianism. So you argue that the US has ceased to be a full liberal democracy and instead is a competitive authoritarian regime. Lucan, could you maybe elaborate what you mean by this and how that is different than, for example, what we're seeing in Turkey?
Well, Turkey, I think, is open to debate exactly what's going on in Turkey. But broadly speaking, competitive authoritarian countries, which proliferated primarily after the Cold War, basically combine important elements of both democracy and authoritarianism. So on the democracy side, you continue to have genuine elections, real elections, not just like facade elections like you see in Russia today or Uzbekistan, or opposition's allowed to operate openly. They oftentimes win elections, not as often, but quite frequently. And I think, so you have sort of the trappings of what, in fact, many sort of in the broader public would equate with democracy. People think, well, how can you call it authoritarian when the Democrats literally swept the November 2025 elections and are expected to do incredibly well? And this is where sort of Stephen and our work has stepped in and say, no, just because you have competitive elections does not mean that you don't have vast abuses of democracy, vast civil liberties violations that are sort of also essential to competitive authoritarianism. So in competitive authoritarianism, above all, you have the weaponization of the state, the use of the security services, the police for partisan ends in ways that fundamentally tilt the playing field in favor of the incumbent. So as a result, elections are real, but highly unfair.
I want to bring in a quote from Professor Reichardt, who can't be here right now, because he wrote in an article that many terms, including the term authoritarianism, are sometimes treated as a comfort label. And he said the concept of authoritarianism primarily refers to a form of rule, but it fails to adequately analyze the ideological dimension. And if we take in philosopher Jason Stanley, then we have to see that the ideology behind Trumpism might be fascist even. If you look at the theory of great replacement, if you look at racism, xenophobia, the invocation of a mythical past. And we talked about this, we see how it plays out in real life when we have manhunts through ICE, and we also have a White House that has a red button online on their websites where you can report suspicious aliens. These are, one could argue, elements of fascism. So I wonder if you include that idea, that fascist ideology, also in your analysis of authoritarian regimes.
So, first of all, Jason Stanley is a very good friend of mine. But I do think, I don't think it's completely crazy to sort of see elements of fascism in contemporary United States. You take sort of Stephen Miller, you take Greg Bovino. These are figures in ICE. And sort of certain elements of the government have ideologies of white nationalism. That's all there, and certainly ICE itself, felt very kind of fascistic. But I think the important thing, and this is why I think it's wrong to say the United States is fascist. I think the United States, by some definitions, may have a fascist government. Individual ministers or secretaries with fascist ideology, but the regime itself is not at all fascist. I mean, what kind of fascist regime even has an opposition? I'm not even talking, you're talking about, consolidate, Italy, Italian fascism at its height, or German fascism. It didn't even have an opposition, much less one that could operate openly and win elections. That is completely foreign. So I think sort of fascist government, non-fascist regime.
Rahel, there's a debate right now going on in Germany how to define the new forms of fascism that we're seeing. What do you think about the current state of the US if we hear this, that Trump and his people might be fascist, but the regime and the state itself are probably competitive authoritarian? Do you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I can agree. I mean, I would say that this whole debate about should we call it fascism or not is somehow, I mean, it's important. It's important to somehow sharpen the concepts that you're working with, because concepts grasp something, let you see something. I mean, we already heard this in the introduction. On the other hand, it is somehow, I mean, we shouldn't fight about the concepts, we should fight the thing itself, and we should try to understand the thing itself. Having said that, I prefer, I think that the concept of fascization is a very important concept and a very helpful concept.
How is it different from fascism?
How is it? For three reasons. First is that it's a process. So if you talk about the fascization of a society, you point out that this is a process, and the process, it's not only that we are not yet there, but it's also, I mean, it's open-ended. You do not know whether we get there or not. But there are tendencies, there are elements who lead in this direction, and this is something that comes up with this process concept, processual concept here. The second thing that I think is important here is to see that fascism is a bundle of different elements, and some of the elements might already be in place, some of the elements might not be in place. Not only, and I agree with you, I mean, as long as one has an opposition like the United States still have, as long as you have those, I mean, still counterpowers and so on, it would be weird to talk about, to say that the United States is a fascist state already. But there are elements, and there are elements who, in a certain constellation, become more powerful, come together, and might lead into a direction where things are getting even worse. The third element that I like about the concept of fascization, I don't like the thing, is that you can grasp how much it really depends on where you are in a society, how different groups are targeted differently. So if you are an undocumented immigrant or refugee, if you are what Hannah Arendt would have wrote about the displaced persons and the fact that this situation will go on, will be a defining characteristic of. She thought about the 20th century, and now it's also a defining characteristic of the 21st century. So if you find yourself in a situation, in one of those camps at the European borders, inside of Europe, as they plan it, if you are, taken by ICE in the United States, then you have it really different. Then you have an experience that borders to, or already. Then it's maybe pointless to talk about whether this is already fascism or not. But you are dominated by people who execute their power over you in a way that, we might want to call fascism. And this is not only true for these extremes. It's also true for. It has been true for people who are victims of racism for quite a long time, which is also the reason why a lot of people who work in this tradition, in the anti-racist and black radical tradition, are very much in favor of the fascization concept, because they think this is a way to spell out how for certain parts of the citizens or non-citizens, the fascist experience is somehow normalized. It is the way they have been living for quite a while already. And that's what I think is interesting about the concept and makes it a useful concept.
And that brings us to the questions of if these elements of fascization are a new phenomenon, because I recently talked to Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a black civil rights activist, a legal scholar, and she pointed out that it is too easy to see fascism as something that is over there. Because of course in the US history it used to be something that was in Europe, that was not native, so to speak, to the US. But she was like, she said that if we look at the racial hierarchies in state policy, the political violences, the extrajudicial killings, the economic exclusions, then we have to see that fascism is not a new phenomenon. And so is it a predominantly white perspective to think that fascism or fascization is something foreign to the US?
Well, the vast majority of people, black, brown, and white, don't talk about fascism or fascization in the United States, so I think it's somewhat of a moot point. I actually think, I don't love the term fascism for discussions in the United States. There are clearly fascist elements in MAGA and MAGA ideology. I think it's more useful to use the term ethno-nationalism. And I think ethno-nationalism has been with us in the United States in very authoritarian forms for a very long time. This is what we're seeing now today, the reaction, the violent authoritarian reaction against our country's transition to multiracial democracy. We saw something very similar in the United States in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, in the aftermath of the Civil War in the US South, when we very briefly experimented with male multiracial democracy, extended rapidly the suffrage to African Americans in the late 1860s. There was a very violent, very authoritarian, if you want to use it, very fascist-like reaction against it that ushered in 80 years of authoritarian rule in a large chunk of the United States. So this is not new. Fortunately, we have not reached remotely the level of terrorism, state-backed and state-tolerated terrorism and violence that we saw in the U.S. South in the 1870s and 1880s. So in that sense, it's not new. I'm just not sure that fascism is a particularly useful term.
Lucan, do you agree?
So I agree. I mean, I think basically the term fascism is double-edged. I think at one level, I think part of the reason why people use it is it kind of raises the stakes. So basically it's saying I guess three-way thing. First of all, Kimberly Crenshaw, when she talks about it, she makes very important points, which I think I completely agree with. Obviously, is that different Americans live very different lives and face very different legal systems, and that is absolutely so much the case. And I think actually Jason Stanley himself has also highlighted that as well. That part is undeniable. Again, I'm not sure it's because Timothy Snyder, my colleague, and Jason Stanley have used it. It's to sort of highlight the stakes involved. That we have to wake up. We're sort of are we sort of Weimar United States? And in that sense, I think it can sort of get people's attention. But I think the flip side of that, and this is why I really think it's I don't like the use of the term, is that one thing is the sort of scholarly definition, how we use it and how Jason Stanley uses it and others. But the other thing is also what kind of images it evokes in people's heads, which for most Americans, to put it crudely, is death camps, right? And the danger is that if you have a term that so obviously does not apply, then what it does is it gives people an excuse to completely sort of dismiss any concerns about American democracy. So that's what I worry about. And that's in fact kind of what happened, I think, to be honest, I think with, is that a lot of the sort of the almost like, the sky is falling type of worry. We're sort of, so kind of, inapplicable that people just said, oh, well, American democracy is fine. So I think that kind of had the opposite impact. That's really what I worry about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I agree. I mean, I do think that there is a danger in using those concepts because you can overstretch it and then it doesn't mean anything anymore. And it can also be seen as some kind of a false alarm. As long as people think that fascism is only when you have already killed millions of people. But this is not the case. I mean, this wasn't even the case in historical fascism. That this is the only and defining element, and that's only fascists in this very moment. So I do think that it plays, and this again is why I would go for this processual concept, fascisation instead of fascism, because it is also important to see that those are elements. Mm-hmm. Hannah Arendt as well has talked about elements and origins and elements of totalitarianism and fascism, and those elements, when they come together in a specific constellation, then at some point it might be fascism. But even then, it's going to be something new. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not only that fascism is different from that you shouldn't overstretch the concept such that every kind of domination, every kind of state violence is already fascism. That would be a mistake, I think. You should also be aware that what we are experiencing and maybe what is to come is something new. I mean, even if it was fascism, it would be new fascism. Mm-hmm. And in this constellation, there are so many new elements, and so many new elements, for example, we live in a little bit, after neoliberalism in some way, or still within, but also after neoliberalism. If you're looking, it's not only if you look for have they already killed millions of people, but it is also if you look at those fascist, authoritarian, ethno-nationalist movements, they are individualists in some way. So this idea that fascism is, or that what we should be looking for is this process in which individuals are merged into one, into a unity that stands behind the Führer and so on. Trump might have some aspects of a leader that has those components, but not to be compared with the enthusiasms that fascist leaders could evoke in people. And you have fascist movements all over the world where, I mean, this kind of leadership is simply absent, or at least not, or this kind of mass movement that would be unity, where the individuals would merge into this kind of. So we have like rebellious authoritarians. We have anti-authoritarian authoritarians, and so on and so on. And then we have artificial intelligence. I mean, in all these changes within economy and society, so it will not be the same.
Yeah, interesting. I want to go a little deeper into this because we're already kind of trying to understand how did we get to this point. And I want to look briefly at the underlying causes. I mean, we've talked about one historical continuity now, which is racism, but another one might be, and I think that's also something that you try to say, is capitalism, potentially. And this might be one point where the panel disagrees. Rahel, you just published an article citing Max Horkheimer, who said one does not want to talk about capitalism, then they also must remain silent about fascism. So what role does capitalism play in our analysis right now?
I mean, the other way around. Horkheimer said we shouldn't talk about fascism unless we talk about capitalism. What role does capitalism play? I mean, I would say there are some very deep tensions and contradictions within liberal, democratic, bourgeois society, and they are what I would call regressive crisis or crisis inherent in those in our societies, and even as long as they were like liberal democracies, that in authoritarianism or fascism or ethno-nationalism find a regressive answer. And some of those tensions are, I mean, deep down in the very structure, in the very, I mean, in the way that those societies are designed, in the way that our democracies are designed as well. For example, that you in liberal democracies, citizens are, I mean, there is this stretch between being a citizen with like equal rights, freedom, being treated as a person on a formal level, and then the other side, namely the material level, and the material way in which this freedom and equality translates into your actual living conditions. And there's something about this, the way that economic questions are somehow bracketed within within this kind of democracy, that creates contradictions and tensions. People think, what can I do with this only formal equality, if at the same time I find myself at a place in society where I not only do not have the resources that I would need in order to have a decent life, it is also about having a say in how those resources are created and how those resources are. So I think it's very important not just to talk about economic deprivation as one of the sources for authoritarianism or fascism, but about democracy, about the way that people can determine their own lives and have the feeling that they really can do so. And I do think there is a problem. So. Which also means that just defending the status quo of our liberal democracies will not do the job.
Mm-hmm. And given the deepening levels of inequality in the US, but also how readily many of the business leaders aligned themselves with Donald Trump, would you both make an argument saying that capitalism could serve as a safeguard for democracy or not?
Let me go back, first of all, and agree entirely with your final point, which I just forgot. So I'll, getting to the point of whether capitalism can save us, let's first ask whether capitalism is causing this problem. First of all, there are many ways to die, and there are many ways to be ill. And the United States democracy is and has been ill in multiple ways for quite a while. As far as I know, and I'm not an expert on capitalism, capitalism everywhere has always had contradictions and tensions. That's not new. That Western democracies set issues of redistribution on the shelf for the last 40 years, and that has great consequences, for sure, especially in the United States. I think one way in which the United States democracy is ill and was ill even before Trump was the vast accumulation of wealth, concentration of wealth in the hands of a relatively small number of individuals who were beginning to exercise outsized influence in politics. They were political scientists before Trump even thought about running for president. Mainstream political scientists describing the United States as no longer a democracy but an oligarchy. The problem is much worse than it was even then in the era in the last 10 or 15 years, where we see the emergence of tech oligarchs with unseemly amounts of money, who are, for the first time, at least to my knowledge, in our lifetimes, beginning to dream authoritarian dreams. So one way democracy is sick is that billionaires were buying our politicians. That was happening before Trump. Another way in which democracy is sick is we have created a bunch of billionaires who are beginning to think about a world after democracy. They've not yet sort of figured out how to put that into practice, but we know they're starting to dream of it. That's worrying. None of that has a hell of a lot to do with Donald Trump. Donald Trump beat the billionaires who were buying our politicians. The billionaires who were buying our politicians bought all the Republican politicians who ran against Donald Trump in 2016, and he beat them because Donald Trump is a populist. I think the driving force of Trump behind Trumpism and MAGA, you can blame it Monday to Friday on capitalism if you want. It's a reaction to my country's transition to multiracial democracy. We have, in my lifetime, experienced an extraordinary assault on social and cultural hierarchies that had prevailed in the United States and in Western democracies for 200 years. So through the time that Hannah Arendt wrote about or was thinking about the 200-year anniversary of the United States, for the first 200 years of U.S. history, white Protestant men dominated every social, economic, cultural, and political hierarchy in the United States. And then in my lifetime, all of that changed. We experienced an extraordinary step forward in not ending those social hierarchies, but in challenging those social hierarchies. The number of Black and Latino members of the Congress quadrupled between my bar mitzvah and 2020. And I'm not that old. The point that African Americans experience a different state than white Americans obviously is historically true. It is, through 2016, less true than ever before in the United States. The United States was making serious strides toward a real multiracial democracy. We had not gotten there, but we were getting close. And I think the fundamental cause, if you look at surveys, if you look at the issues that MAGA activists prioritize and champion, if you look at what this government is actually doing in practice, what it cares about, it is all about trying to roll back the United States' transition towards multiracial democracy. That's what this is about. It's not about capitalism. Sorry to say it.
Lucan, I want to focus maybe on the tech industry and the role they play in the political shifts that we're witnessing right now. What's your take on their behavior and also their ideologies?
So I think that really speaks to what Steven was saying. That I think what we've seen in the tech industry is a product of the vast accumulation of resources, and that they have basically, in a sense, way too much power. The fact that someone like Elon Musk, could sort of dictate policy. I mean, he, in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, a single tech guy without even a formal position in government, essentially, wiped away whole agencies, fired 12% of the federal workforce in a way that was, completely ignored the Constitution. Okay, so at that point, a lot of people thought that this is an oligarchy. So, there's two vision of the United States, which comes out of the sort of capitalist literature, very Marxist, is that, the state doesn't matter. The state is a sort of, I forget the term, a boardroom for the bourgeoisie or factory owners. So that was one idea, that, what's really, that Trump is simply a cover, and what's behind him is, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, right? But what we found out, and I think this is important, is that, in fact, that was not the case at all. That the minute Elon Musk challenged Trump, he took Elon Musk to his knees. Right? The issue, Elon Musk, as powerful as Elon Musk was, the richest man in the universe, being the president of the United States put him in a far more powerful position than any of these, economic leaders. That's one thing. Second one, so what do we mean by capitalism? So if I'm going to just go on a little screen, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
You can just tell me to stop.
Go ahead.
To get Steve, because he's heard this a million times. Okay. What do we mean by capitalism? So, I'm not an economist. But, crudely put, it means that societies with a powerful private sector, right? And that basically means every country in Western Europe, including Sweden in the 1970s, right? These were all, whatever you want to take, all sort of, Western democracies or sort of capitalism. So when I say capitalism, we mean any society with a private sector, with a strong private sector. A couple of things. So first of all, our argument is that to actually have a democracy, you need a strong private sector. Does not mean that, you don't have regulation. It does not mean that you don't have vast redistribution. It just means that you have a private sector in which enterprises, one's house, cannot just be randomly seized by the state. And this private sector is absolutely essential for democracy, because it, we talk about resources. It creates it gives, especially rich capitalist countries, and this is important. Not just all capitalism. We have to talk about highly developed capitalism, wealthy, where you have a rich middle class. Those people who are making decent living are the ones who preserve the civil society, who give money to the democratic organizations that defend democracy. Those middle class, they were the ones in Minnesota who who had the time and the resources to defend democratic institutions. If you hadn't had that middle class, and all of them, as in Russia today, were state workers who were dependent on the state for their livelihood, you don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? That was the case in sub-Saharan Africa until the 1990s, right? So I think that in that sense, capitalism, the sort of strong private sector, is essential. Even though, of course, that's wholly consistent with redistribution, with high levels of regulation, all that stuff. The other thing, just quick last point, then I'll shut up. I think it's important to distinguish between capitalism as a system of private property and capitalists. So capitalists are, throughout history, Germany, obviously during the fascist period, Italy, United States right now, very often support dictators. There's no question. But the system itself of private property, I think, is something that bolsters democracy.
Mm-hmm. So the private sector is a key element that is important right now. Rahel, you took a lot of notes. Do you want to respond to that?
I do think that the conversation about capitalism we have to postpone. Just two remarks. I mean, one thing is I totally agree that there's not one single cause, and there's not a monocausal, it is not, we shouldn't go for a deterministic idea of how capitalism necessarily creates fascism, because there are all these different elements that come together. I mean, what I try to emphasize is this loss of control and the idea that people, it's no coincidence that even during the Brexit campaign, this idea, take back control, has become so extremely important. And I do think that, maybe the backlash thesis that you promote, saying, okay, we have made enormous progress and now we have this backlash. There is something to it, of course. I mean, there is a ressentiment-driven reaction to those moments of progress. But on the other side, I think this is too simplistic a picture, because then it's just going back and forth. I mean, there were progresses, social progress, and all these moments of cultural liberation, and then there is a backlash, and somehow we do not understand how this comes about unless we think of it as some kind of a zero game. The power that you gain, we lose. But this is not the case. This is not the case in some of those groups and the minorities that MAGA and all those movements target. I mean, it's not easy to see how same-sex marriage how anyone would lose something by the fact that someone else is allowed to live his own life and to engage in whatever kind of relationships and to have a fluid idea of gender identity and so on and so on. This is not the zero-sum game that you would have in questions of economic resources, where you could say, yeah, no, they get it, there's a redistribution, they get it, and we lose it. But that's not the case. And in some of the most important elements of fascist or authoritarian populist propaganda. And it's important to think about what is going on here. I mean, why do people need those scapegoats? Why are they targeting those groups? Why are they even even the migration question is not a zero-sum game. Even here, at least in Germany, everyone knows that economically spoken, we need migrants. It's not, the idea that, those are not only politicians from the AfD, but also conservatives who brag about, we will have them out pretty soon, and we have already made such progress in letting those, getting rid of those refugees. And do you think, from every kind of, instrumental economical point, this is somehow crazy. Mm-hmm. And we need to understand what is going on here and what is also creating those emotions, what is creating this. So I think the simple, the backlash idea is not enough. And I do think that, and again, I do not want to be too insistent on terminology here, but I do think that regression as against backlash is something different. Regression, or the idea that this is a regressive crisis reaction, is different from just saying this is a backlash because someone got too much, and then of course there's a counter movement. It has something to do with not having the right and adequate answer to those crises that we are confronting. And some of them are, we have, and this is new with respect to historical fascism, we have the ecological crisis, we have a crisis of inequality, we have a crisis of democracy in terms of people being alienated from democracy, and so on, you name it. Multiple crises. And I think this has a lot to do with, as I said, the loss of control, and part of this is the dynamics of capitalism and the economic dynamics that people think they are victims of or somehow driven by without having a say in what they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. And it's also important to analyze the multiple crises that we see in the right way and frame them in the right way, so that fascism doesn't seem like the plausible answer to these problems.
And maybe it's even not the right question. I mean, it's not only that there's a right question, but the wrong answer, the wrong fascist or authoritarian or populist answer. Also, the way we frame the questions, of course, is up for debate.
I mean, we could probably do a deep dive into the role of capitalism, but we don't have the time, unfortunately, so we should move on.
That's good, because I've reached the limits of my knowledge about capitalism.
Okay, right.
I don't know anything more.
Perfect. So let's move on to the question, what can we do? So what could prevent the further erosion of democracy? And before we discuss the systemic factors of that, I want to ask if the system of Trump could ultimately collapse from within, because some analysts argue that it will. One view, for example, is drawing on Max Weber's idea of the patrimonial rule, is that a mafia-style state system eventually destroys its own governing capacity by dismantling the institutions that it depends on. Or another argument says that the strategy of flooding the zone with shit will eventually become self-defeating because the administration itself will be
full of shit.
Will be overwhelmed with the chaos. If we, for example, look at the war against Iran right now. So do you both find either of those arguments convincing that the system could collapse from within?
Only in part. I mean, and here's where I think fascism is not the best lens through which to analyze the United States. It is true that this government is very patrimonial, that it's very corrupt, that it's flooding itself with shit, and that it is chaotic and making poor decisions that are weakening it. But the way that Trumpism will end is it will be defeated in elections. It will be defeated from without. So the argument about totalitarianism was that you couldn't defeat it from within the regime. It would take some kind of an external force. It won't. But I remembered the point that I agreed with that you made, which is that defending the status quo has not been enough and will not be enough. Absolutely agree. But the way that this authoritarian offensive will end, and all it will do is bring us back to Biden or maybe Obama-era democracy, one full of problems and challenges. But the way that we will go back from the authoritarianism of the Trump administration to at least a minimally, even somewhat dysfunctional democratic system is elections.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Lucan, I would like to hear your stance on this, of if you think that the system itself could collapse.
Yeah, no, I think that's a bit optimistic. I do think that sort of it's important. It is quite. First of all, I think it is squarely patrimonial, and in that sense, it's much more patrimonial than it is oligarchic. In the sense that Trump, his power comes through the distribution of resources and it's effectively patronage to his supporters. But the reason why I think ultimately it won't fall from within, Trump has been unique in his ability to maintain intense unity within his supporters. Essentially, there's like a 35% floor for his support. No matter what he does, there's literally. This is almost, it almost feels like there was a scientific experiment to see how, what are the limits of his support. He's done everything. He's violated every promise around inflation, around, war in foreign countries. It's a disaster. When the tariffs, very often hurt his own supporters, cause them to lose jobs. Yet, he maintains this 35% support, which I think is very much identity-based. It's not based on sort of economics. And this, 35% is a lot, right? It's enough to sort of certainly ride out, until, 2028. So I think in that sense, it's not the case that it's going to go from within, and I think it's only going to go through elections.
Okay, then let's talk about elections and the possibility of manipulation of elections. Jason Stanley, I quoted him before, he argues that gerrymandering has redrawn the electoral districts in such a way that Democrats virtually have no realistic chance of winning.
That's bullshit.
Yeah, that's bullshit.
Okay, why?
I love Jason.
He points to the Supreme Court and says that it has effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act and says that if the Democrats want to stand a chance in the midterms, they'll have to win by a margin of 15 or 20%. So I would be interested why you say that's bullshit.
What the Republicans have done, and it is very anti-democratic, is use gerrymandering at a national level in an unprecedented way to steal an estimated 10 seats. So it is possible in this election that the Democratic Party will win the popular vote for the House of Representatives, and that according to the map of districts that existed 1 year ago, they should have won a majority in the House, and that they will not. If the Democrats win by 3 or 4 percentage points, the Republicans could win the House. And that would be, and this could happen, that would be an undemocratic election. That's possible. And that's true. I mean, Jason is absolutely right that the Republicans carried out a national gerrymandering scheme that tilted the playing field modestly, but in a real way, against the Democrats. If the Democrats win by the amount that they're projected to win by, 6, 7, maybe 8 points, they will probably win control of the House of Representatives. That doesn't mean we're living in a democracy. Hungary was not a democracy last year when Fidesz was defeated. Oppositions sometimes win unfair elections. I think there's a pretty good chance that the opposition wins an unfair election in the United States. It only takes a victory of about 5 or 6 points, not 15 or 20, for the Democrats to win control of the House.
So, and this, I think, goes back to the, sort of the concerns about calling it fascist, because, I think it is important, obviously, to recognize the authoritarian dangers, but there's also really a huge danger of fatalism. That, I think there's this popular belief in the United States and elsewhere, especially, countries that have not experienced authoritarianism, that if it's unfair or authoritarian, the opposition is completely excluded from the possibility of winning. But but that's simply wrong. As Steve and I have shown in our work, there are 15 tons of cases in which opposition has won unfair elections. Nicaragua in 1990, Hungary just now, right? And almost certainly, I think, the United States, so I think it's really important not to sort of somehow think that because an election is authoritarian, that we should therefore kind of give up. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that Jason's saying that, but that is the implication, that if you say we can't win, that the Supreme Court has rigged it, the natural sort of logic is, well, might as well just stay home, which I think is I'm not, again, Jason's not saying, if you're listening out there, Jason, don't, still invite me to your dinner party, okay, please. That's, I think that's really wrong-headed.
Mm-hmm. Can elections still function as democratic safeguard, even if they're not fully free or fair?
Yes, they can, because they're still, saying something. I mean, just back to the fatalism thing. I mean, Jason is certainly not giving up, and certainly not in a state of mind where he would give up fighting. I do think that, yes, elections, of course, they should be able to do something. I do think that the civil society moment here is important, though. And I think, when you ask me what kind of hope I have for not only the United States, but also for all the other countries who are in danger here, my hope is, I think, a bit more on the civil society side than yours. I do think that Minneapolis and the fact that, this was heroic. People went on the street knowing, and you all know that, people have been killed here. defending the rights of their neighbors. And this is something, there is a vibrant civil society still, there are all these local initiatives, there are still people who might be, I mean, who are not yet in this depressive fatalist mode where you would give up on everything. And also, if you look at, I was in New York this fall. In the beginning, I mean, when I first came, I really had the impression that everyone, even everyone on the left, is somehow, I don't know, exhausted and depressed. And then Mamdani got elected. And not only in those, I mean, I took part in some of those marches and some of the rallies where, I mean, he spoke, and I mean, to see how this movement is a real movement and a well-organized movement, and something that is not just by coincidence and somehow a charismatic politician shows up and all of a sudden he wins. There is something behind this. And this is important, and it's something that gave people hope. And I mean, back to the capitalism and private sector thing. I mean, in European welfare state terms, this would be left-wing social democracy, of course. But it has something to do with wanting to decommodify certain goods, for example, housing or health, education, and so on, that shouldn't, I mean, that do not well when they are treated as, I mean, in the private sector as commodities, and within those dynamics. This is an important lesson to learn, I think, that, and again, I do think that Mamdani, of course, there's a very specific constellation again, but this strategy to, again, not to defend, not to just defend the status quo, but also to, I mean, to come up with some alternative instead of just being anti-fascist or anti-authoritarian. I do not think that we will win anything by just closing the ranks here. There has to be something that is, for which people develop the same kind of enthusiasm as some people develop for right-wing populist contents, but also something that gives them hope in terms of living a decent life, living their own life, having something to say with respect to what's going on in the society they live in. And that's, I think, a more important element here.
I would very much agree with that. I mean, I think one of the important things, and I think that gives me hope, I think the sort of initial focus on sort of, as you said, closing ranks, or even in the 2024 election when Kamala Harris really focused on sort of anti-Trump appeal, is it closed off room for experimentation. And I think I don't actually really agree with much, to be honest, that the Democratic Socialists of America say. But one of the things that I do think is that, one, I don't think they're an existential threat. But I think they're sort of representative of the sort of broader spirit of experimentation and just trying stuff. But I think which includes, like, as you say, decommodification of housing, the supermarkets and all that's good stuff. My only point there is, one, you have to recognize that the thing that wins elections in New York City is not necessarily going to win it in another part of the United States. So there needs to be a multiplicity.
Fair enough.
Of approaches and yeah, so that's my only, that the Democratic Party is a coalition, and it's okay to have disagreement, but mainly you need experimentation.
I would like to go back to the role of civil society, because the US surely does have a very well organized and well funded civil society, but business leaders, foundations, wealthy donors have quietly distanced themselves from progressive causes. We've seen this. They're sometimes not funding fights for civil rights, for LGBTQ rights anymore. So can a resistance persist even without proper funding in the US?
This is the beautiful role of capitalist development.
Yes.
You walked into that. Let me say one point first. So it is not true that sheer anti-fascism can't win. It can win, it just can't achieve an enduring victory. You can win elections, right? Olaf Scholz won, the British Labour Party won, Joe Biden won, but they won without a project. And here I completely agree with you. I think there's a global problem in the democratic West that neither the center-left, social democracy, nor the left has any kind of ideological project that motivates people. The only political force in Western democracies today that generates real enthusiasm is the far right. And that's a problem. That's a real challenge for both the center-left and the left. And I agree with Lucan about experimentation and the fact that the emerging urban socialists in the United States are a really interesting model to follow. Civil society, really quickly. It is true. I mean, one of the great consequences of authoritarianism in the United States is that Donald Trump very effectively used the state as a weapon to threaten, to bully, to punish, to coerce the private sector, even really rich guys like Jeff Bezos, into either cooptation, supporting the government, or in most cases just moving to the political sidelines, self-censorship, and stopping funding progressive movements and progressive organizations. That is absolutely right. That was most stark in the first 6 to 9 months of the Trump administration, much of 2025. As it turns out, we are such a rich capitalist country with 23 million millionaires, with 10 million people who earn $250,000 a year or more, with 62 law firms that earned at least $1 billion in profits last year. That's a lot of resources out in society. Now, some of those people are right-wing, some of those people support Trump, but dozens of them didn't. And so there are still, it turns out, a lot of millionaires and a few billionaires that are willing to spend on progressive causes, who are giving money to Democratic candidates. When the big law firms all capitulated to Trump and stopped defending the most vulnerable in the United States, which is a criminal thing to do, a criminal degree of abdication, dozens of new law firms emerged in their place with skilled, effective lawyers, many of whom had defected, abandoned the big law firms because they were aghast at what the big law firms had done, and represented these folks. So if we were a poor country, if we were not a developed capitalist country, if we were Benin or El Salvador or Nicaragua or Albania, those resources wouldn't exist in society. But they do. And civil society in the United States, whether it is in Minneapolis or voter rights groups in the South, or law firms who are defending the hundreds of people who are being unjustly, unfairly, illegally targeted by this government, they actually have a reasonable defense. Mm-hmm. And were we not a rich capitalist society, those resources wouldn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Lucan, I want to look at the bigger picture and also include recent developments in Europe. If we look at Hungary and Poland, we saw that sometimes you can change things, you can turn it around. And would that also be a recipe for the United States, or where do you see the United States headed within the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think that certainly, first Poland in 2023 and Hungary, which is absolutely a stunning election, in April, showed us, reminded us of something a lesson that Steve and I have been writing about for decades, but that opposition can win unfair elections. I think Magyar had basically basically much worse than the Democratic Party in the United States. He completely excluded from large audience media. He hadn't appeared on the main news station for 18 months. He had no billboards. So even when you're faced with conditions that are actually much more unfair than the conditions faced by the Democratic Party today, you can win. So the question is, so what do we have, what's ahead of us in the United States? So there, I'm both optimistic but also pessimistic. So the optimism, again, following from Hungary, is I think it's very, very likely, for example, that the Democrats will do quite well, retake the House in 2026. I also think it's quite possible, that will retake the presidency in 2028. So that's the optimistic part. That it's almost, I would say, virtually impossible in the economic conditions of advanced capitalism in the United States to consolidate authoritarianism for reasons that Steve mentioned, that resources are so distributed. If you're in Russia, you lock up the richest man, the opposition literally has no funding then. That's the one source. Khodorkovsky in 2001, it's over, kaput. You lock up whatever, the richest man, there would be hundreds of others to take his place. Okay. At the same time, that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. First, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the most important is you have a deeply authoritarian Republican Party, in which literal Nazis are sort of in the mainstream.
And on the rise.
And that's not going to go away, right? You look at, Vice President J.D. Vance, he's very much in league with these guys. As long as you have one of the major parties being authoritarian, you are always one election away from some form of autocracy. So in that sense, I think objectively speaking, the most likely medium-term scenario is alternation between, dysfunctional democracy under the Democratic Party and some form of competitive authoritarian rule under the Republicans. The second thing that I think is important in terms of long-term implications, maybe we can talk about this more, is, I think the utter destruction of the civil service and federal bureaucracy, that I think, the kind of patrimonialization of the American state, which I think is quite hard to put the genie back in the bottle. But I can talk about that more or whatever.
I would like to give you the opportunity to also ask your questions. We have 2 microphones, I think up there. You can just raise your hand and then we'll maybe have an open discussion. I saw one person right here. That's the first one, the second one, third one, fourth, and fifth. Okay, I think we have enough for the first round. Thank you. Could you maybe hand the microphone to the person right here, and then we go to the middle. Yes. There's something.
Hello.
But is that? No.
You talk a lot about institutions and infiltration of institutions by political leading governments. Is it something that in a democracy we have to live with? That is it possible for the leading government to infiltrate the institutions like media and judicial branch and stuff like this? Or is there anything maybe the next democratic House and Senate can do, or the next democratic president, to limit the, or even in Germany for maybe the next AfD when they win the election, is there anything they can do to prevent it from happening, the infiltration of the systems?
To prevent?
The infiltration of the systems, for example, the media system or the judiciary system, if there's preventative measures, so to speak.
Are we taking questions one by one, or
what is best for you?
Whatever you're the boss.
Then let's go one by one, and you just answer now. Yeah.
Okay. This is one of the problems with a democracy, with an open society, is you can never entirely prevent or immunize a democracy from authoritarian infiltration without ceasing to be a democracy. In Germany and the United States, there are really polar, different philosophies on how to deal with authoritarian threats. Germans, for very good reason, empower the state to take action to prevent anti-constitutional, anti-democratic forces from gaining power in a way that would never be accepted, even though I'm quite sympathetic to it, would never be accepted in the United States. And this is exactly the question that Lucan and Daniel and I are thinking about in the book. In the United States, we have a great reluctance to touch anything in the name of free speech and democratic norms. At least until 2024, the Democratic Party was reluctant. They were reluctant to prosecute Donald Trump, committed the cardinal sin of trying to overturn an election, and we were reluctant to even prosecute him. The Brazilians knew what to do with a president who tried to overturn an election. The South Koreans knew what to do with a president who tried to kill democracy. We did not know what to do. But we're learning. We're watching South Koreans, we're watching Brazilians, we're watching the Poles, we're watching Magyar in Hungary, and realizing that bolder steps are necessary, that democracies have to play hardball. That's an American metaphor, but have to be tough in defending the rule of law. And so this is all very, very new for the United States. Even in the authoritarian period, the horrendous violence of the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, we committed the same mistakes of allowing the Confederate ethno-nationalist terrorists to hold office, to go back, to hold their property, to be free. And so this is all very, very new for Americans. But I think we are learning quickly that we're going to have to be much tougher this time around in purging the state of criminal elements and corrupt elements and holding those who've committed crimes accountable. We've totally failed at that.
The second question from the person in the orange shirt.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to ask you about your perspective on the foreign relationships between Trump's government and Latin America.
And sorry, in what?
Latin America.
Latin America. Can one say that there is like a new imperial aim, like from the perspective of Timothy Snyder about Russia, but also a way to strengthen the policies against, strengthen the policies in favor of these ethno-nationalist policies by supporting the jail projects in El Salvador or policies of anti-migration with Colombia and Panama?
I guess I have to take that one. Yes and no. Trump has extraordinarily has a colonialist mentality, and this is not this is not an organized government. They talk about a Don Road doctrine and they use big words. They do not have a coherent plan in Latin America, but Trump wants to do things that are unthinkable in the United States for the last 100 years. He's not going back to Cold War interventions like Guatemala in the 50s or Chile in the 70s. He's going back to the 1920s. What the United States is doing in Venezuela today is colonialism. We don't use the word in the United States, but it's colonialism. We are calling the shots in Venezuela. Donald Trump says as much. We are stealing their oil, and we are making the decisions about who invests in the mineral sector in Venezuela, and we want to keep it that way. And the aspiration, which they may well succeed at, the goal is to do the same thing in Cuba. And they may. Trump has been very fortunate that he has a lot of very, very friendly governments in South America, in Central and South America today. I mean, that's mostly a matter of, I don't want to say luck. I mean, the problem of organized crime and violence in Latin America has helped fuel the rise of right-wing populists in Colombia, now in Peru and Ecuador and elsewhere. And those guys, they love Trump. I don't think that the love relationship is going to last very long, but right now you've got a set of governments who don't need colonizing because they are going to cooperate quite a bit with Trump. Delcy Rodriguez is at the head of the line, which is ironic given that she comes from the left. But the Colombian government and obviously the Salvadoran government and others will in fact cooperate quite a bit with Trump. My guess is if Trump does something awful in Cuba, and as the contradictions and the colonialism of the relationship in Venezuela become clear, Trump and Trumpism are going to become less popular in Latin America, and that even right-wing governments in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador and Argentina and in Chile will begin to distance themselves a bit from Trump. I think I would not be surprised at all to see something like the dynamic we see with Giorgia Meloni happening with right-wing governments in Latin America.
The third question was over. Fourth? Okay. And the third was right next to you somewhere. Right, you in the white shirt, person in the white shirt, exactly. I also saw you over there.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think for most of us, you are probably one of the most referenced authors in our essays. So, yeah, I'm currently writing my thesis on how populist and authoritarian leaders use anti-corruption rhetoric to justify institutional changes. We see it, for example, in the US with Trump has portrayed parts of the federal bureaucracy as a corrupt deep state. My question is, when this kind of rhetoric is used to justify removing or replacing public officials and increasing political control over state institutions, or can it become a mechanism of democratic erosion? And how would you interpret this development through the framework of comparative authoritarianism? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take it. So that's a very important question. So one of the things that work, so when Steve and I first started doing our work on competitive authoritarianism, we were studying countries like Nicaragua, Ukraine, Russia. All these countries had states that were very friendly to authoritarian abuse, right? That were sort of already weapons of the leaders. When we came to what we call the new competitive authoritarianism, these are places that emerged not out of full-scale autocracy, but out of consolidated democracy, from India to Hungary to Poland to the United States. They had to cope with a state which was actually quite resistant to political interference and weaponization. So, one of the core elements of democracy that I think is really important, and I think you have my understanding you have quite strong here in Germany, is an autonomous bureaucracy. We tend to think of the bureaucrats as these boring, bureaucracy has a very negative term, but you cannot have a democracy unless you have a civil service that is resistant to political interference, right? That is absolutely, otherwise, the president as the United States can just sick the police on opposition. And so autocrats realize this. Trump realizes this. Orban realizes this. And out of this emerges the concept of the deep state that you mentioned. And the deep state, has real meaning. It comes from Egypt and Turkey, where really was this sort of big bad thing. But it's been used essentially as a pejorative to sort of describe essentially democratic states, as in Hungary and the United States. And it's an excuse to get rid of sort of impediments to the weaponization of the state. So I think it's hugely important, and it's essential, essentially it's a kind of first step. The first thing you have to do if you want to destroy a consolidated democracy is to destroy the independent bureaucracy, and you do that with terms like the deep state, which I think have been very important.
Mm-hmm. The fourth question was over there.
No.
It stays interesting. Mysterious.
Yeah, now it's working. So thank you, first of all, for being here. And maybe a question to Professor Levitsky. So in Germany, many people still assume, even if it's changing from now on a little bit, that once Donald Trump is no longer in office, the United States will gradually return to the political normality we associate with Bush and Obama and Biden and so on. So do you think this assumption is realistic? Because we already talked about that the government is fascist and not a regime. And what do you think, how durable are like the institutional and political changes, especially in the Republican Party, and of course the sociological changes that Trump has brought about in the United States? And which of these changes do you think will outlast the most the presidency, his presidency, and which could be reversed? And to bring in like a little bit the European perspective, what do you think are the long-term changes, the consequences maybe in American politics which will shape the relationship between Germany or the Europe and the United States?
Okay, I may not get to the last one, but we can go back to a minimum level of democracy if the opposition wins the next election. But we're not going back to the stable democracy of the pre-2016 era. Mainly, as Lucan mentioned earlier, because of the radicalization of the Republican Party. I wouldn't even characterize the government as fascist. I think that's overstated. But the Republican Party, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, which dominates, smells a bit fascist and is moving in that direction. There is no evidence, zero evidence, that the Republican Party is in a position to return to the basic liberal conservatism of the Reagan era. The Republican Party of Mitt Romney, Reagan, Bush, that is done. It's 18 people. MAGA is going to dominate the party. So this is going to continue to be an ethno-nationalist, illiberal, and I think authoritarian political party for, at least as far as I can see, political scientists can see about 10 feet ahead of us. So the danger, as Lucan mentioned, even if the Democrats win, best case scenario in 2028, there is a looming danger of a return, possibly worse, in 2032. Also, even in the best case scenario, Democratic forces win the election, the next government governs democratically, which I think there's a good chance of. Trump has broken some critical state institutions. Again, as Lucan mentioned, the Justice Department, the Public Prosecutor's Office, which since the 1970s had been a pretty effective state institution, has been totally corrupted and politicized. In the best case, that will take decades to rebuild. The FBI, security agencies have been deeply politicized and corrupted. Again, in the best case, everybody doing the right thing, decades to rebuild. States are easy to break. They're hard to build. But things have also been built that will be hard to dismantle. The paramilitary force that is ICE, this lawless agency that is deploying armed, masked men in the streets as if we were El Salvador in the 1980s, is going to be a challenge to dismantle. And probably its legacies will stick around for a while. There are norms of abuse and mistreatment of both, especially non-citizens, but even citizens, that have been established in the last few years within the office of the Department of Homeland Security that are going to be very, very difficult to revert. So we can get back to a democratic government. I'm fairly confident about that. But that democratic government is going to inherit a much weaker state with some real authoritarian practices in parts. I also don't think, I think we may never restore, for better or for worse, you guys can decide, the U.S.'s prior position in the world. I think that's cooked.
There's one over here, and then after, yeah, you're on the list.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Levitsky. I have two questions with regard to the Supreme Court, which, with its super conservative majority for lasting probably a generation to come. And so the first question is, how much is the Supreme Court part of the transformation to an authoritarian form of state?
I'm sorry, could you...
How much do you see the Supreme Court being part of the transformation of the US to authoritarian kind of regime. And the other one is, I mean, they expanded the power of the president in an unprecedented way. But if Trump is gone and we would get a democratic president again, how would you see the role of the Supreme Court in interacting with the democratic president with the same executive power that they granted their protege, Donald Trump?
Yeah, great questions. And Lucan may have things to add to this. You know, I don't see this as a Trumpist court. This is not a court captured by Trump. It's a very right-wing court. Two of the court members are aligned with Trump, and four of them are very right-wing. I think they have enabled Trump's authoritarianism in at least two very important ways. One, almost inexplicably, they derailed the legal proceedings against Donald Trump in 2024 and ruled that he enjoys immunity basically in anything he does. So the fairly meager effort to hold Donald Trump accountable for trying to end American democracy was derailed by the court in the summer of 2024, and as an extra gift, they gave him immunity for anything he does as president. That empowered him. The other thing that they've done is give president, along the lines of what Lucan was saying, give the president the power to do whatever he wants with the state. So no more independent state bureaucracy. Donald Trump can politicize and legally, constitutionally, politicize and weaponize the state however much he wants, except for the Federal Reserve Bank. And again, I think it was a combination of, these guys are so right-wing, they want to go back to a world before the Great Depression. That's really extreme. They want a pre-modern, classical liberal state, which no advanced industrialized society has even contemplated, but that's what they're doing. They are combining extreme libertarian ideology with a bit of naivete about Trump and handing the machinery of the state to Donald Trump. I don't think it's because they want Trumpist authoritarianism, but that is in fact what they've helped to create. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess my only thing I want to add is I think this speaks to what a new Democratic administration has to do, which is essentially to play hardball, right? And I think there's going to be, in the sort of DNA of the Democratic Party is a sense of compromise, is a sense of going slow. That is exactly what's wrong. In both the area of first of all, the Supreme Court, I think given the fact that the Supreme Court, we don't know why they are the way they are, but they are clearly sort of facilitating authoritarianism. And as a result, having that Supreme Court maintain its power is an existential threat to democracy, in my view. So, we'll
discuss this, yeah.
But I think what that means is that we're going to have to entertain proposals that might have seemed crazy 10 years ago. Expanding the court, really fundamentally reforming the Supreme Court to, expand the membership, to create some sort of rotation, term limits, and the like. This is all very hard. It hasn't been done recently, but I think it becomes absolutely essential if we're to maintain our democracy. The other point of hardball goes back to the discussion of ICE, and what Steve was saying about the fact that ICE has become essentially this right-wing paramilitary. Under Trump in the early 2025, there was a dramatic expansion of ICE, and you can be sure that the people who came in with minimal training, they were desperate for people, so they very much lowered the standards. There are almost certainly huge numbers of MAGA supporters. And so what you need to do if you are to maintain American democracy is to purge ICE or eliminate it wholesale. Yeah. That these kind of radical hardball actions that I think both of us would have been very uncomfortable with a few years ago, I think.
In How Democracies Die, I opposed expanding the court. But now I think it's probably necessary.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, I'm done.
Thank you very much for the event and for the talk, and thank you for coming from Berlin, from the US. Actually, I have two questions for you. First of all, how is it possible that in a democracy there's and I'm just asking it in a really polite way, I'll try to ask it in a polite way, that there's an island, like an Epstein Island, and very big businessmen from the United States and from other parts of the world, they go to this island, politicians, very high-ranking politicians, future presidents, they go to this island, and they are accused of doing pedophilia, doing crimes and acts which a normal human mind cannot comprehend. What about that these files are still not exposed or fully exposed, and there's still no criminal proceedings going on? As I know, no one from these people who are mentioned in this Epstein file, mainly, for instance, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, he's not convicted of anything. How is this possible?
Yeah.
This is the first thing. The second thing is, even though me, as someone who admires the United States and loves the people of the United States, how is it possible that a democracy, so-called democracy, and the leader of the free world has a privilege to invade any country it likes, make regime changes wherever it likes, install their own puppets, like in Syria, which used to be ISIS commanders, and founding ISIS, the ISIS branch in Syria.
Wasn't that Turkey?
Together with Turkey, which is also one of the main allies of the United States. I mean, how is this possible? I just want to mention this actually as some kind of polite
have to keep
protest.
the questions briefly, I'm sorry. These are two questions and
okay.
to answer.
But with all my respects to the American people, I love the American people. There are millions of people like this who are thinking like this, but it's just a small protest also. A question and a small protest. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
So I would just say one quick thing in reaction to that. I think we're talking about the sort of incredibly aggressive American foreign policy, which both Steve and I are quite horrified by, to make it clear, is really a product of the competitive authoritarianism that has emerged. You know, believe me, pre-Trump, the Soviet Union and the USA had lots of problems. We had the Iraq War, but there used to exist far more constraints on this type of behavior. So one of the striking things about the invasion of both, Venezuela and Iran is that there was virtually no policy process. There was no consultation with the military, with other sort of stakeholders that there would have been normally. This has created sort of, opened up, made foreign policy much more unpredictable. And I guarantee you, for example, that I think it's very unlikely that in sort of pre-existing democratic institutions you would have had an invasion of either Iran, or Venezuela. So I think it really is a product of authoritarianism.
Really quickly, you asked how could a democracy allow an Epstein Island or the kind of rampant U.S. imperialism we've seen in recent years? I think the answer to that question is that in both cases, it's the absence of democracy. It's the fact that rich people have been able to buy their way to unity in the United States, and particularly under the Trump administration, you have a whole set of friends, including Donald Trump, who are protecting themselves from accountability, and agreeing with Lucan that there are no constraints, none, against the militaristic whims of a single individual right now. And that leads to horrible and often mistaken foreign policy choices, which we're living.
Mm-hmm. So these are two examples of lack of democracy in the US. As we've seen today,
absolutely,
the US the opposition, the Democrats have to learn to play hardball, as you said. And we also have to prepare for regime instability. We have to be prepared that even in the best case, even if the Democrats win and come back to government, they will inherit a weak state and things will be very hard to rebuild while they were easy to break. Thank you, Rahel. Thank you, Lucan. And thank you, Steven, for this discussion. It was really informative. Thank you so much. Very profound answers. Thank you for the excellent questions. And have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and please feel free to join us at the reception outside to just go on to discuss, grab a bite, and have a glass of wine or water. Thank you.
Thank you.